the person can take this game and they can immerse themselves in the world, or they can do things with it, and it's fun for them. It's always what we're shooting for. It's basically how to create fun for people, and that's an elusive target, but it's something that we're always trying to do.
Among games that have defined the real-time strategy genre, Command & Conquer is seen as one of the most influential titles. The CNC franchise, along with Warcraft and StarCraft, shaped the identity of RTS games during the 90s and would influence the designs of countless similar strategy titles in later years.
They started it, and every other strategy game you can practically think of evolves from there.
Even though the franchise ended with a whimper instead of a bang, it managed to create an indelible impact on the history of video games. Join us as we take a look at the rise and fall of Command & Conquer.
Well, the very first real-time strategy game that we made, and frankly, probably the very first game anybody would recognize as a real-time strategy game, was called Dune 2. We shipped this product, it did very well, and we decided to do our own original property around the concepts, the core compulsions which made this strategy game so much fun.
Unit ready.
Command & Conquer began development in 1992, shortly after Westwood released Dune 2. Taking place in an alternate history of modern day, players could choose to side with the Global Defense Initiative or the Brotherhood of Nod. Using FMVs or full-motion videos to tell the story, Westwood employees would play multiple roles in the cutscenes. Most notably, Joseph Kukin, who worked at Westwood as a voice actor and vocal director, played the role of the main villain, Kane.
Now, do it again in French and German. I want 300 copies made and sent to every TV station in Europe. You have the satellite for another 10 minutes. Is that camera still running?
The campiness of the FMV scenes would become a hallmark of the series and added a B-movie feel to the story. A common element of this series would be the hunt for the alien material known as Tiberium, which was visibly inspired by the spice melange from the Dune series. In the CNC lore, Tiberium was an alien crystal that crashed on Earth through a meteor in 1995 near the Tiber River in Italy. While it is very valuable, direct human contact with it is most often lethal. In the first game, Tiberium simply acted as a resource to the player, but it would play a greater role in later games. The campaigns were centered around two theaters, Europe for GDI and Africa for Nod. Many of the missions had screens where the player could choose between 2 or even 3 locations to progress through, though this would usually end up being the same objective on a different map layout. The game was capable of multiplayer via LAN, with several modes to choose from. Frank Klepacki composed the iconic soundtrack for Tiberian Dawn, which would help shape his career later on. The first Command & Conquer was released in the summer of 1995 for DOS on 2 discs, one for the GDI and one for the Nod campaigns, which was rare at the time. It would go on to sell over 3 million copies and was ported to multiple platforms, such as Macintosh, Sega Saturn, Windows as the Gold Edition, PlayStation 1, and Nintendo 64.
And at the time, a lot of people didn't think that the game had a lot of possibilities. We had original forecasts in tens of thousands of units, like 60,000 units, versus the 2+ million that we sold. So it was quite a leap of faith to get that product out. Now, once we actually showed it to the public, once we saw the people's eyes light up, once we saw them playing, I think everybody kind of got a hold of the idea that this is something really different, something special, something big.
In 1996, the game was supported with a single expansion pack called The Covert Operations, which added new missions for both Nod and GDI, as well as a Jurassic Park mode to the game. In the meantime, Westwood's work with Dune 2 inspired many other studios to create real-time strategy games. Most notable was Blizzard Entertainment, who released Warcraft: Orcs and Humans in 1994, which, as their developer stated, was made out of the desire to see what they could do better. For the next couple of years, the releases of RTS games by Blizzard and Westwood followed each other, seemingly in a race.
So what we figured was, hey, we could take the basic mechanics of the game, create all new sides, all new units, all new balancing, and change the graphics to some extent, but we really need a new theme.
Instead of continuing with the storyline of Command & Conquer, Westwood would then work on the first of many spin-offs of the series with Command & Conquer Red Alert. Red Alert took place in an alternate history of World War II, where Hitler was killed before he rose to power, thanks to Albert Einstein's time travel experiments. Without Hitler, the USSR began to take over, and the Allies were forced into a different war. The game was originally positioned narrative-wise to be a precursor to Command & Conquer. In the first Red Alert, it was shown that Kane was a close associate of Joseph Stalin, advising and sharing secret information with him. As a consequence, the war would lead to the rise in power of the Brotherhood of Nod and the formation of the GDI, but this proved to be a problem in terms of continuity and was ignored in later games.
Comrade Chairman, I am the future.
The technology seen in Red Alert was not just based on believable units like soldiers and tanks. Unique ideas inspired by failed real-life experiments and conspiracy theories, such as extra-large Tesla coils, Iron Curtain devices, and the chronosphere became trademarks of the Red Alert universe and iconic elements in RTS history. Red Alert introduced connectivity with the Westwood online server for multiplayer in addition to the previously available LAN. Skirmishes against the AI were included for the first time, with 3 difficulty settings further adding to the game's longevity. The soundtrack was once more composed by Frank Lepacki, with Hell March becoming one of the most recognizable music tracks in gaming, even winning the 1996 Best Soundtrack Award from the PC Gamer magazine over Trent Reznor's score for Quake. The game received 2 expansion packs in 1997. Counter-Strike added new campaign-specific units and maps to the game, as well as a series of secret ant missions, in which the player was tasked with holding off an invasion of giant mutant ants. The Aftermath further supplemented the game with new single-player missions, units, and balancing changes to the multiplayer. Around this time, a multiplayer-only spin-off of Command & Conquer dubbed Soul Survivor was released to the public. In it, players would choose only one of the units from the original Command & Conquer to fight in an arena against others in a free-for-all fashion, with upgrade crates and one-way portals scattered across the maps. The game was a drastic departure from this series in terms of gameplay and received criticism from fans for its repetitiveness and shallow design. Soul Survivor never gained the popularity that its RTS predecessors did and was mostly ignored and subsequently forgotten. The success of Red Alert meant a return to the universe in a few years, but there was trouble behind the scenes. Westwood Studios' owner company Virgin Interactive was facing financial difficulties in the late 90s and was forced to sell many of their assets. As a result, on August 17, 1998, Electronic Arts bought Westwood for $122.5 million and would effectively take control over the Command & Conquer franchise to this day. One other Virgin-owned studio from Irvine, California was also purchased by EA and was designated Westwood Pacific. The first games to be released under EA's roof were Red Alert Retaliation, a PlayStation port of the Red Alert expansions, and Dune 2000, a remake of Dune 2, outsourced to Intelligent Games, which featured an engine similar to that of the CNC games, improved Harvester AI, skirmish and multiplayer modes, and full-motion videos, which had become one of the mainstays of Westwood-branded RTS games. The first Command & Conquer game to be distributed by EA was Tiberian Sun, released in the late summer of 1999, after several delays, most of which took place in the final development year. Taking place in the year of 2030, the game introduced more sci-fi elements to the series. The battle between the GDI and Nod grew with the world being taken over by Tiberium. Besides having the 2 storylines, players could also choose what missions to do, and could achieve an edge by dealing with side missions before the main ones, as it would mean that the enemy faction would receive fewer reinforcements. The production values were improved with Tiberian Sun, featuring a new game engine and more recognized actors for the FMV sequences. Besides series star Joseph Kukin, Michael Biehn and James Earl Jones also starred in Tiberian Sun.
Well, in the 4 years between Command & Conquer and Tiberian Sun, the game Command & Conquer had been imitated so many times in so many different ways. It really put a really high bar for Tiberian Sun. And in fact, computers had come a long way. They were much more powerful. So we were really able to explore the 3-dimensional aspects of the world, the characters, the units themselves, take tanks that were now hovercraft and the Orca flyers that became Orca bombers and all sorts of cool things like that. Just all this imaginative stuff that came out of the science fiction of the mixture of the alien technology along with these sort of evolution of war machines.
Despite the improvements, the game's development problems were showing. From the numerous bugs which remained unresolved even after several patches, through inconsistent graphical elements and balance issues, to the fact that many intended features were disabled or completely removed. Improved systems like a dropship loadout screen in the campaign were in the works, but were later scrapped. Despite the issues, Tiberian Sun sold well and was praised for its atmosphere and world building, with the soundtrack by Frank Lepacki and Jared Mendelsohn being particularly helpful in building the setting. In February 2000, it received an expansion pack called Firestorm, which was the first instance where both campaigns were canonical and occurred at the same time. New units were introduced for both sides, as well as mostly new characters. The storyline took place after the Second Tiberium War, where GDI lost contact with the Philadelphia station due to a severe ion storm, and Nod's newly reactivated AI Cabal went rogue and stole the Tacitus for its own means, waging war on both GDI and Nod with its cyborg army. Firestorm also introduced a special multiplayer mode called World Domination Tour, which was only available on the old Westwood online server. It included a world map separated into regions, with contested ones available as battlefields for both sides. After a period of time, the players' win-loss ratios would be calculated and the region was given to the winning faction, and after a while, the entire map would reset. In 2000, Westwood returned to the Red Alert universe with Red Alert 2, delegating its development to the Irvine studio, although some developers, artists, and audio team moved back and forth between the two studios. The year is now 1972, when the USSR invades the United States, and thanks to the psychic Yuri, the US falls under Soviet control. This was the first time that both sides in a CNC game were completely distinct, both functionally and visually, and it was the beginning of customizable units in the franchise, with the Allied IFV able to change its weapon and function depending on the infantry unit it carried. Skirmish and multiplayer received an upgrade by allowing players to take control of different nations from each side. These choices would affect which units they would have access to during a match. From a design point of view, Red Alert 2 continued the series' tradition of asymmetrical balance. The USSR featured stronger units, while the Allies had more diverse units and were stronger in the late game.
The real ideas behind Red Alert 2 are to give the player lots of options and lots of choices that he can be creative with in the gameplay. And this applies to the units where, each unit has multiple different roles that it can take on.
The game was based on a modified engine from Tiberian Sun, which was largely polished and improved, and helped form a modding community that is strong to this day. Co-op missions were now available in multiplayer, as well as a reskinned World Domination Tour. Red Alert 2 was a critical success and was followed up by an expansion. Yuri's Revenge continued the original story with Yuri taking over the world, requiring the Allied and USSR to defeat him in their own way, with the help of Einstein's time machine, whether he permitted you or not, depending on the faction you played as. Both the USSR and Allied factions got new units to use, and Yuri's army was playable in skirmish and multiplayer modes.
They will not escape. Player defeated.
Meanwhile, Westwood Pacific had just released their RPG, Nox, and with help from the team at Intelligent Games, development was started on Emperor Battle for Dune, a sequel to Dune 2 and Dune 2000. Despite a completely new art style, storyline, game mechanics, and engine, Emperor failed to gather much attention. Despite Westwood's pedigree for the RTS and RPG genres, their next game came out of left field.
Up there! It's a Commando! The helipad is down!
Command & Conquer Renegade was not only a return to the first game setting, but was also a first- and third-person shooter hybrid. Renegade followed the exploits of Nick Havoc Parker, a GDI commando. Instead of continuing the main game storyline, Renegade takes place during the First Tiberium War and followed Havoc's mission to save scientists kidnapped by Nod. The game is known to have been in development as early as 1997, with a leaked tech demo for the PlayStation showing some early models, most likely in the unfinished engine of the sports car GT game. It was later decided to be a PC exclusive called Command & Conquer Commando, starring Logan Shepard, General Mark Shepard's son. He was later relegated to a tutorial guide in favor of Havoc. The game was ultimately released in February 2002 after numerous delays. While the campaign was not received well due to poor map layouts and AI, many praised its unique multiplayer mode, where players were split into GDI and non-teams, able to purchase transformations to different infantry units and campaign characters, as well as vehicles and aircraft, with each base structure having its own role similar to the ones in the original Command & Conquer.
Conflict of interest? No. I got interest in conflict.
However, in early 2003, EA closed the main branch of Westwood Studios with the final nail in the coffin being the failure of their MMO, Earth and Beyond. Before the studio was shut down, Westwood had been working on several continuations of the Command & Conquer franchise. There was a planned sequel to Renegade, with one of the drafts taking place after Yuri's revenge and trying to tie into the original CNC, with the Soviet Union dissolving into several factions, including the Proto-Nod faction, the Scavengers, and the supposed protagonist faction, Romanov's Rebels. Renegade 2 made it past pre-production with some assets released to the fans, but was ultimately canceled before the studio's closure, due to the possibility of the game taking purchases from Battlefield 1942. Command & Conquer Continuum was an MMO based on the Tiberium universe. Players could choose between different factions to play as, with more content to be added after release. Finally, there was Command & Conquer Incursion. This would have been the real third game in the Tiberium universe. The game would also introduce the alien species known as the Skrin, who would be revealed as the species who sent Tiberium to Earth, as well as a planned expansion pack featuring the return of Cabal. The Skrin and some of the designs of Incursion would find their way into Tiberium Wars. While EA Pacific was close to finalizing their next game, Electronic Arts made the decision to fold the team, along with the remnants of the main Westwood studio, into EALA, which was already made up of DreamWorks interactive developers at the time.
First opportunity to bring Command & Conquer as a franchise into the 3D world. Finally, we had 3D hardware that could actually generate these huge cities with shadows and characters and tons of hundreds of units, all battling it all out at the same time.
Using a modification of Westwood's W3D engine named Strategy Action Game Engine, or SAGE, EA Pacific released Command & Conquer Generals in 2003, which was in production since the release of Yuri's Revenge. Despite the name, Generals had no relation to the universes of previous Command & Conquer games and took place in a future version of our world. The GDI and Nod factions were replaced by the US, China, and the Global Liberation Army, or GLA. In this game, the GLA was a fanatical terrorist group who wanted to take over the world, with the US and China positioned as the only two countries to take them on. Like previous games in the series, each of the three factions had their own units, tech trees, and style of play. The US had the most advanced and expensive units. China was able to mass large armies, and the GLA could make use of sneak attacks.
Sniper!
Command & Conquer Generals sold well enough to get an expansion in the same year, 0 Hour. 0 Hour's claim to fame was the inclusion of the General system, originally cut from the base game. Each faction had multiple generals that each emphasized different aspects of the faction. By selecting a general, the player could access special units unique to that general, but with some kind of cost associated with it. The Air General, for instance, had access to cheaper and more powerful air units, but did not field any tank units. From 2004 to 2006, EA Los Angeles worked on the Battle for Middle-earth series set in the Lord of the Rings universe, using a gradually upgraded Sage engine that powered CNC Generals. It spawned 2 main games and an expansion pack for the second, with the latter outsourced to Breakaway Games. While these games did not sell as well as the Command & Conquer series, they still have small but loyal communities that play and mod them, despite the games currently being in licensing hell. For fans who wanted to return to the traditional Command & Conquer universe, they would have to wait until March 2007 with Command & Conquer 3: Tiberium Wars.
You can't kill the Messiah.
Tiberium Wars officially introduced the Skrin faction to the franchise. As with previous games in the series, each faction had their own unique takes on units, strategies, and base design. The Skrin campaign could be unlocked after finishing the GDI and NOD storylines and were also playable in skirmish and multiplayer. Introducing the aliens also came with designing the faction to be different from the other two. The Skrin were immune to the effects of Tiberium and had their own unique superweapon. FMV cutscenes made a return to the series. Joseph Kukin reprised his role as Kane, along with new additions like Michael Ironside, Billy D. Williams, and more. The big point about Command & Conquer 3 was it trying to take over the Esports crown from StarCraft. EA heavily promoted Command & Conquer 3 on the professional scene with the touted Battlecast system. Battlecast allowed players to set up matches, spectate in games, and allow commentators to provide commentary during play. Tiberium Wars was followed up with an expansion titled Kane's Wrath in March 2008, with the development done largely by Breakaway Games, to which EALA had previously outsourced the development of The Rise of the Witch King. Kane's Wrath would introduce some factions similar to the ones in Red Alert 2 and Generals, along with new units for the three main factions. Instead of having new campaigns for all factions, the expansion story focused exclusively on Kane, and traced his actions from the events that followed the conclusion of Tiberian Sun's Firestorm expansion to after Tiberium Wars, with his trusted new AI, Legion, as the player's POV character. Kane's Wrath also introduced new game modes in the form of PC's Global Conquest and Xbox 360's Kane's Challenge. Global Conquest allowed players to play on a turn-based map to try and take over the world and defeat the other players. Kane's Challenge on the Xbox 360 involved Kane testing the player's abilities by ordering him to fight one sub-faction at a time.
Peace through power!
No, touch nothing. We mustn't do anything to disrupt space-time continuum.
The next game in the series to be worked on was Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. Released in October 2008, the story took place during the mid-80s, where the USSR was about to be defeated. Using time travel, they went back to kill Einstein, who was critical to the Allies' defense and eventual victory. However, taking Einstein out altered the time stream further and brought in Japan, or the Empire of the Rising Sun, as a new superpower. Red Alert 3 had an interesting development. It was originally and unofficially announced in December 2004 by executive producer Mark Skaggs. However, he was given a period of 9 months to develop it, after which he effectively left EA and the game was shelved until 2007. The game ultimately had the longest development time of all EALA's games, being in production for approximately a year and a half. Red Alert 3 would mark major changes to the base gameplay of the Command & Conquer series and was ported to the Mac OS, the Xbox 360, and for the first time, PlayStation 3. The new faction brought with it new units, strategies, and balancing. The Empire's units had the ability to transform into different modes at will, altering their utility. The Soviets relied on brute force, while the Allies had a high-tech arsenal. For the first time in the series, every campaign map was designed around co-op play. You could either play them online with a friend or use an AI partner. Besides the Empire's transforming units, every unit in the game had some kind of special ability or something for the player to control. This made Red Alert 3 more micro-intensive compared to previous games in the series. Another major difference was a greater focus on naval combat. Sea battles in most RTS titles were downplayed in favor of land and air fights. With Red Alert 3, naval battles became a major focus of the game, with each side getting a variety of units. Red Alert 3 had an expansion with Uprising, which added 3 mini-story campaigns for each faction and one special campaign which followed the Empire's psychic unit, Yuriko, and was about commanding her instead of an army. Uprising also added in the Commander's Challenge mode. The Challenge mode was built around fighting generals similar to the Zero Hour expansion for Command & Conquer Generals. The different generals would attack you with varying strategies and teams of units. The consoles received their own versions of Uprising with Red Alert 3 Commander's Challenge. However, these did not include the 4 mini-campaigns featured in the original PC expansion. Red Alert 3 sold well enough, but was not without some PR problems. The game featured a DRM system that limited the number of machines you could install a single copy of the game onto, to 5 per serial key. After outcries from fans, this system was modified to be able to deauthorize individual installations so they could be freed for future use in patch 1.05.
Targets fanning out.
During this time, plans for another spin-off of the Command & Conquer series were announced. Tiberium was to be a squad-based tactical shooter in which the player would be able to coordinate their units against the Skrin forces invading Earth. In Tiberium, players would have taken control of GDI forward battle commander Ricardo Vega, the protagonist of the Keith R.A. DiCandido authored Tiberium Wars novel, in a campaign that takes place after the events of Tiberium Wars. The game was canceled shortly after it was announced in 2008 by EA, citing a lack of quality as the main reason. EALA made one last attempt at revisiting the concept of a tactical first-person shooter with Project Camacho, this time set in the Generals universe. The game would have allowed players to take control over American resistance members as they fought against Chinese belligerents invading the USA. Unfortunately, Camacho never made it past the concept phase, with only scant concept art and prototype images from its short existence in 2008 and 2009 still surviving. Interestingly, the MMORTS concept of Sole Survivor was revisited around 2008 when EALA started development on Command & Conquer Arena. The game was to be a multiplayer spin-off of Tiberium Wars and Kane's Wrath, aimed at the Asian market. However, the project never made it far into development and was ultimately transformed into Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight, after the developers were forced by the higher-ups at EA, who ordered that the game was made as a full AAA release and put in a box. This decision was controversial even within the studio, with some notable members, like multiplayer designer Greg Black, leaving the company as a result.
So we have a new class-based gameplay.
You have a mobile base now, so no longer are you stuck in one place on the map.
We're going a little more in the accessible standpoint of it, but I want to reinforce that we're not removing the strategic depth.
I'm sorry, I totally missed that word you said.
What happened to the screen? Are we going to see them reappear?
One more time, I'm totally not understanding.
Progression, earning experience applies to the entire game all of the time, no matter how you play it.
What's going on with this? I mean, how is this adding to the already compelling CNC experience?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So it's a much more friendly way to kind of get into RTS, a little bit less intimidating than StarCraft 2.
Based on that feedback, we actually brought back some Tiberium harvesting, which we had completely gotten rid of.
We have a class system, which is generally more common with first-person shooters than with real-time strategy games.
For the veterans of CNC, are they going to be able to adapt? Is this going to be something that's of interest to them?
Well, we're hoping they can adapt.
I just want to encourage players to give CNC4 a shot. I know we're trying a lot of things a bit different.
You know, it's time for a bit of a change. A lot of RTS games are getting kind of to be a little bit of the same.
Tiberian Twilight is merely a CNC game by association.
Command & Conquer 4 probably isn't what you expected.
In 2010, the series began its fall from grace among RTS fans with Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight. Tiberian Twilight, being essentially a forced and rushed redesign of the CNC Arena project, was a massive gutting of the Command & Conquer design from top to bottom. The Skrin, who were introduced as a playable faction in Command & Conquer 3, were relegated to a neutral faction. Power and general base building for the GDI and Nod were also taken out. Base building was replaced by a new mobile HQ called the Crawler and a focus on class-based battles. Each faction could take one of three types of crawlers. Depending on which of the three you chose, offense, support, or defense would determine your options and units available. Instead of defeating your opponent's base, the game focused on capturing areas of the map for points. It's important to point out that Command & Conquer 4 came out after the successes of Company of Heroes and Warhammer 40k Dawn of War 2, both with a focus on point capture. The real cut to the gameplay came with Twilight's new persistence system for unlocking units. When you began to play Command & Conquer 4, your account started at level 1. Playing through the campaign or skirmish matches online would award you experience points. The only way to unlock new units, structures, and technologies was to level up. The problem was that this system instantly created an unfair disadvantage for new players wanting to jump into multiplayer. The differences between a new player and a fully leveled player were huge. thanks to stronger units, more options, and the experienced players being all around better. This also made fighting against the AI even tougher due to them having better units starting out. Unless you grind experience to raise your level, your only other option was to use the game's co-op mode for the campaign. After the problems with Red Alert 3 in terms of DRM, EA doubled down with requiring an always-on internet connection for Command & Conquer 4, even if you were playing it for the single-player story. For fans of Command & Conquer, this was the game that just devastated the franchise. Following the poor reviews, the RTS team at EALA was rebranded to Victory Games. In addition, EA took the FPS team that resided at EALA and rebranded them to Danger Close Games, who were put to work on the Medal of Honor series. The studio managed to create 2 installations before being rebranded once again as DICE LA. What came next was seen by fans as 2 major nails in the coffin for the Command & Conquer series. In 2011, EA announced that a sequel to Command & Conquer Generals was officially in development.
So the core concepts in the original Command & Conquer RTS games were really about building a base, defending that base, and building an assault army that you could go attack the other base.
First thing we said is we need to kind of wash the stain of CNC4 away. And to do that, you really have to get back to your roots, to get back to what it was that made your fans in the first place.
Command & Conquer Generals 2 was supposed to take the series back to the base building and resource management gameplay that Command & Conquer 4 went away from. In August 2012, it was then revealed that the Generals 2 moniker would be dropped, and the game would instead be a part of the live service for multiple free-to-play games that was simply named Command & Conquer. The content of what was up to then known as Generals 2 was to be the first game on the service. The project received further scrutiny when it was announced that it would not feature a single-player campaign. In an effort to please fans, EA later announced they'd introduce downloadable single-player missions after the game's release. But the news would be too little, too late. The game's troubled and slow development, coupled with pushback from fans, would eventually prove to be too much. And on October 29, 2013, EA pulled the plug on Command & Conquer. On the same day, EA also closed Victory Games and the project was completely canned. The main reason cited was negative feedback from players who participated in the game's alpha trial and that EA was looking for other options to continue the project under a new studio. However, a Victory Games employee under the tag EA Baylor claimed that the statement on the closure and the reasons thereof were entirely pre-written by EA higher-ups, and that the real reasons for the project's cancellation were, quote, corporate politics and shenanigans. During the development of Command & Conquer Generals 2, EA Phenomic was working on a browser-based strategy MMO titled Command & Conquer Tiberium Alliances. Tiberium Alliances was a massive downgrade in terms of strategy and design, focusing more on the browser MMO trend of increasingly bigger pay and time barriers to keep people playing. Command & Conquer Tiberium Alliances was announced in December 2011, went into beta in March of 2012, and was released in May of that year. After this, a spin-off called Red Alert Alliances was also in the works. However, it was canceled later in its development when Electronic Arts closed EA Phenomic in 2013. The maintenance of Tiberium Alliance's servers was given to Easy Studios, a free-to-play development studio formerly part of DICE. The studio Envision Entertainment, which was partially made up of former Phenomic employees, became the developers of Tiberium Alliances again in 2015. The game is still being maintained, but there have been no announcements regarding the future of the franchise as a whole.
Our base is under attack.
Yes, sir.
The Command & Conquer series has come a long way from the days of popularizing the RTS genre. According to EA in 2009, the franchise sold about 30 million copies. Instead of the series going downhill immediately after the creators were no longer a part of it, EA Los Angeles did manage to put out several great takes on the Command & Conquer formula. Tiberium Wars, Red Alert 3, and Generals were all well received by fans and reviewers alike. Looking at the changes down the line, EA wanted the series to be the next great esports game. That meant speeding up the gameplay and becoming more micro-intensive over time. The co-op focus that started with Red Alert 3 could be viewed as their attempt at differentiating the multiplayer gameplay from StarCraft. That all culminated with Tiberian Twilight, which had very little of the iconic Command & Conquer DNA. The problem, of course, is that StarCraft has dominated the esports RTS scene, and there is little room for a game similar to it. Although chances of EA releasing a new Command & Conquer anytime soon are slim, the franchise is not dead just yet. The series has found new life through fan-made projects, such as mods and total revamps. Even though the original developers probably won't see their beloved franchise receive an official continuation, Command & Conquer has spawned an online community that's active and healthy to this day. In an age of reboots and spiritual successors, one can only hope that we'll see the return of Tesla coils, rocket buggies, and the Brotherhood of Nod once more. Or at least another series of ant levels. For more and all things Command & Conquer, stay subscribed to GVMERS.